Good morning, Chile and Peru. Obviously, we're here because you told me you were very disappointed with my storytelling and you thought you could do a better job. So fine, go ahead. Tell me what it is you want to read. We'd like to read The Story Giant, please. Ah, yes, that lovely book by Brian Patten. Well, that's fine. Would you like me to tell the children what the story's about? Yes, please. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll read the blurb on the back first. The story giant woke and sniffed the air. Children had come again. When 4 children from different parts of the world dream their way into the story giant's castle, they begin to share stories in the hope that one will be the mysterious tale the giant is desperately seeking. The missing story holds the key to the giant's future, but will they find it in time? Gosh, that sounds very exciting. Chilli, whenever you're ready, go ahead. Around the castle he had woven an illusion of ruins that blocked it from the sight of mortals. To anyone out on the moor, the castle appeared no more than a jumble of ancient stones and a few tall, roofless walls overgrown with lichen and ivy. The story giant was all but invisible, and his voice was often mistaken for the wind blowing over the tumbled stones. It was how the story giant wanted it, how it had always been. He had created illusion upon illusion, mixing the real and imagined till they were one and the same. He was from a time before the ancient pharaohs. He had been intelligent when people were little more than apes, and he had come into existence whole as he was now. The story giant had never experienced childhood, yet his food and drink were the stories told and dreamt by humankind from its infancy onward. He was the custodian of those stories, and his castles were their storehouse. Before writing had existed, it had been hard to keep track of the world's growing pool of knowledge and folklore. People forgot things, but not stories. They remembered stories. Into even the simplest story they'd learned to pour their understanding of each other and of the world around them. And the giant had learned to sip wisdom and information from the stories like wine from a glass. But there was one story the story giant did not know. For thousands of years he had tramped the earth, always believing it would turn up sooner or later, carved in runes on an ancient stone, or found among the pages of a forgotten book. But it never had, and only tonight had he finally realised its importance. Now the thought of not finding the story filled him with dread. In a city called Patna in northern India, a young girl called Rani curled up on the lattice-patterned floor of a small iron balcony and fell asleep. The clamour of the rickshaws and human traffic below her carried on into the claustrophobic, marigold-scented night. But Rani heard nothing. Having worked all day and a good part of the night in the steamy laundry of a hotel in a wealthy part of the city, she was exhausted. She slept dreamily, dreaming of a cool, faraway castle in a land of gentle rain. Hassan al-Sedari's father and mistress had been out most of the evening at an embassy dinner in Riyadh, and though he had begged to stay up until their return, the house servants were set against it. They would not bend even the slightest against his father's wishes, and so here he was, high up in his little minaret-like bedroom, looking out over the mosques to the towers that edged the far side of the city. He turned on the television, which was usually forbidden at this hour of the night, but it was an old film about goblins and giants, and he'd seen it several times before. Sighing, he turned the room's cooling system to a low setting so that its hum would not disturb him, and climbed into his bed. Sometimes Bets Bergman found it difficult to sleep because of the red and blue neon lights that blinked on and off below the bedroom window of the Los Angeles apartment her mother rented. No matter how tightly she pulled the curtains, some light managed to get through. Some nights it didn't matter, but on other nights even the faintest glow was enough to keep her awake. Tonight was that kind of night. She switched on the bedside lamp, picked up a dog-eared book that had been her favourite when she had been younger, and began reading. 10 minutes later she was asleep, the bedside lamp still on, her book on the pillow beside her, open at an unfinished story about a giant. Liam Brogan lay on his bed bunk, or even bunk bed, in the converted fishing trawler he and his father called home. The boat rocked almost imperceptibly as the incoming tide lifted it from the South Devon mud flats where it was moored, and nudged its bow round to face the estuary mouth. Liam could hear the cry of owls, and less frequently the barks of squabbling fox cubs. The sounds were muted by beads of mist and the sea fret that fell onto the woods and lay like a comforting blanket over his thoughts, most of which had to do with school and a book of ghost stories that had been confiscated from him during a maths lesson that afternoon. The story giant woke and sniffed the air. Children had come again. He could smell 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls. They were puzzled but not frightened, and he decided that he would have no problem weaving them into a single unifying dream. But for the moment, they were each still locked in their own private dream. The one called Liam was in the castle's north wing, staring out of the thick mullioned windows at the falling snow. Another child was leaning on a windowsill, looking down into a courtyard where lemon trees glowed in bright sunlight and a faint breeze rattled the polished green leaves. Now and then she would close her eyes, smile, and breathe in the lemon-scented air without a care in the world. The third child, Hassan, was in the library pulling out books which he immediately grew bored with. He did not bother to replace them, no doubt thinking that one of the servants would do that later. There was another visitor somewhere, but the giant could not yet locate her. He put down his book he'd been reading and stood uneasily, his bones brittle and stiff with age. He descended a broad stone staircase flanked by wooden banisters, sections of which had crumbled away, leaving only sharp iron railings standing like rows of warriors' spears. He lumbered on, through corridors and rooms abandoned to the workings of woodworm and time, until finally he came to the castle's massive entrance hall. He pushed open its oak-studded door and looked out upon the outside world. It was neither snowing nor sunny outside. There were no lemon trees. There was no sound of rattling leaves. Instead, the moorland stretched in sombre isolation from one horizon to another. He sniffed the night air. The smell of heather and all the varied scents of the night drifted on the wind. He imagined he could even smell the moonlight that covered the gorse and bracken with an imitation of frost. He breathed in deeply once again, wondering if tonight would be his last chance to gaze upon the mortal world. For the story giant was dying. The process had begun some time ago, and tonight, for the first time, he sensed that it was nearing its end. With each snuffle of the badger and hoot of the owl, death rode faster and faster through the night towards him. Ahead of him, death sent his messengers, world weariness and pain. The giant was not dying in the same way as mortals die. There was no fear for himself, no ongoing fight to stave off the inevitable decline into darkness. Rather, there was the kind of curiosity someone might feel about a sealed room they had passed endlessly without seeing inside. But the story giant did not want to die. He knew that he needed to continue, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the stories he had nursed and cherished down the centuries. It was not death he feared, but the consequences of death. He had caused the stories to be reinvented over and over again. Each retelling and twist had kept them alive and vibrant. His fear lay in the knowledge that if he were to die, the castle would die with him, and the millions of stories it contained would perish for the want of retelling. For that reason alone, it was imperative he lived on. He knew there was only one thing that could save him. Somewhere there was a story that could rescue him from death. It was the single story he did not know. Without it, oblivion beckoned. But what was it, and where, and how had it managed to evade him over so many centuries? The story giant closed his eyes, and as he did so, a faint hope began to stir. He thought of the 4 new children who had suddenly appeared, tonight, on the very night he had finally accepted that he and the castle faced extinction. Could their arrival be a kind of omen? Could it be that one of the children knew the story, the tale that would bring it salvation? His mind soothed by the moorland scents and by this one hope, the story giant turned his back on the night and pulled shut the iron-studded door. It was time to weave the children together. He made for the library where the child Hassan was now asleep, his head resting on a pile of discarded books. Liam turned from watching the falling snow and stood with his back to the window. From a corridor up ahead of him, he heard a voice whisper, "It's weaving time, Liam. It's weaving time." He followed the whisper, his tread on the cold flagstones muted by the dust of moths and the snow blowing in through fissures in the castle's dilapidated walls. The voice ceased the moment he arrived outside an improbably high door. Standing at the window, staring down at the lemon trees had given Rani a thirst. She was convinced that somewhere in the castle was a nice cool glass of lemonade just waiting for her to drink it. She set out to find it, and in a blink was standing outside an unusually tall door behind which she knew, absolutely knew, the lemonade was waiting. Bets Bergman found herself in what she took to be a private theatre. There were several rows of seats, and each seat could have accommodated 2 people with room to spare. Oil lamps hung from the high ceiling, operated by a system of pulleys. The neglected stage was deep and square. Its threadbare curtains were imprinted with golden masks and half hung open. On the edge of the stage, propped against a stack of old play scripts, Bets found a note. Unsurprisingly, it read, "Please go to the room with the tall door on the 3rd floor." Somehow she found she knew the way, but being a bad timekeeper in her waking life, she was the same in her dreams and was late arriving. When she rapped on the door, a deep, gentle voice like none she had heard before said, "Come in, Bets." Behind the door was a large private library. It was cluttered with old sofas and battered leather armchairs. 3 of the walls were covered in bookshelves that reached up to a high vaulted ceiling. More books were piled up on desks and tables. No corner was free of them. Contemporary paperbacks were jumbled up with old leather-bound volumes. Pamphlets and comics jostled for space, with beautifully illustrated editions of the rarest books. A stocky, tough-looking boy with untidy hair, dressed in an old-fashioned duffel coat, a few sizes too big for him, was standing staring sullenly at something, or someone, hidden from Bet's view by a decorative screen. Sitting in a chair beside him was a tubby boy with beautiful olive skin, yawning and managing to look both mesmerised and bored. To his right stood a dark-haired girl holding a glass of lemonade. She was younger than the others, small and fragile and dressed in a long purple dress which she wore a threadbare cardigan. Bets walked further into the room and saw the focus of their attention. Sitting hunched beside the fire in a throne-like chair was what appeared to be a giant. He was not a giant in the huge fairy tale sense. There was nothing fearsome or monstrous about him. It was simply his size that startled Bets. Because he was seated, she could not judge his true height, but she guessed him to be somewhere between 10 and 11 foot tall. He had a smooth, high forehead and thick, flame-coloured hair. Though he was kindly looking, the skin on his cheeks was pitted and scarred, and his hands, which clutched the armrests of the chair, were knotted with age. Into the mantelpiece above the fire grate was carved an inscription that read, "The light of imagination transcends decay." It seemed the giant had already been talking a little while, answering a question that had been asked before Bets had entered the room. He nodded, acknowledging Bets, and then continued to speak. "Usually I leave people who dream themselves into this place alone, and they wake without knowing I exist," he said. "If I had done the same with you, you would all have wandered about this castle, passing through each other as unaware as moths passing through shadows." "Then why didn't you leave us alone?" It was the rough-looking boy in the too large duffel coat who'd spoken. "Because never before have 4 such very different children arrived here simultaneously," the giant said. "It is a unique event in the history of my castle. Why, you have even defied the logic of time zones to appear here as you have." The giant told them a little of his history, reassuring the children that they had no need to fear him. And then he spoke about the missing story and its importance, and of his conviction that they were all, in some mysterious way, connected to it. It's something I feel deep in my bones. Otherwise, why would you be here? He gazed into the fire, silent for a while, his great hazel-coloured eyes fixed on the flames. When he looked up again, his voice was distant and sad. You know stories from separate ends of the earth, he said. Is it too much to hope that among them is the one I long to know? Bet stared at the giant in amazement. You mean you've no idea what the story's about? She asked. If I had the faintest idea, I would have discovered it by now. Tonight might be my last chance to find it, and... He stopped. The pain that had been plaguing him for months passed through him like a wave of splintered glass, and then was gone again. And? Betts prompted him, unaware of what he had just experienced. And I need to hear stories. I need to tell and share them. It is the reason I exist, he said. But what if we don't know any stories? Liam again, still sullen and defensive. Oh, but you do. All of you do. They are hidden in the depths of your conscious minds, and while you are here, you will feel compelled to tell them. This is no ordinary place, said the story giant. This whole castle is built out of imagination. It is where stories take on lives of their own. It is where the fox learns to speak with a human tongue and where the rabbit learns cunning. It is here where barriers between logic and fantasy evaporate and one flows into the other. The giant looked from one child to the next. All this is done through the power of stories, he said. Let me tell you a tale that might illustrate their mysterious nature. And so the storytelling began. Oh, Chilli, that was very, very good. Would you mind if I showed everyone the front cover of the story? No, that's absolutely fine. Let me see what I can do. Just move out of the way, Chilli. Ah, there it is, indeed, yes. Fantastic. The Story Giant by Brian Patten. Tell me, are we going to hear some more later? Yes, but not until tomorrow.